One empire stood on the edge of exhaustion. Britain, the crown of the world, its navy still proud, its flag still flying, found itself gasping beneath the weight of its own ambition. In the early years of the Second World War, the island nation had already spent decades stretching itself across continents, binding distant colonies with iron and paper. It had commanded oceans, ruled cities, collected taxes, and fought wars it no longer fully understood. And yet, as Hitler's armies marched through Europe, Britain's power, once thought eternal, showed cracks that no cannon could repair. The cities were darkened against the Luftwaffe's raids. Smoke rose over London like a slow confession. Factories ran day and night, yet the shelves remained empty. Ration lines stretched for blocks. Citizens shuffled through fog-laden streets, clutching tokens for bread, for sugar, for meat. Each step a reminder that the empire, vast as it seemed, could not protect the lifeblood of its people. Gold reserves dwindled, and the pound, that symbol of imperial dominion, wavered under the relentless pressures of war. There was a fragility hiding beneath the proud banners and disciplined soldiers, a fragility few dared to name aloud. Across the Atlantic, another empire watched. America, not yet fully at war, possessed the engines of production that Britain could only dream of. Factories churned in rhythm, assembly lines moving like clockwork armies of steel, rubber, and aluminum. Politicians in Washington recognized an opportunity, not merely to aid an ally, but to shape the future balance of power. Franklin Roosevelt spoke of support and shared values, but behind the calm words lay a strategy precise and unyielding. Aid could be a weapon. Supply could be leverage. Lend-Lease would be the instrument that turned desperation into dependency. By March 1941, Lend-Lease legislation had passed. The promise was simple. The United States would lend, lease, and supply the nations fighting tyranny, beginning with Britain. The language suggested generosity, cooperation, and mutual survival. The reality, however, carried a subtler weight. For every shipment of tanks, planes, and food, Britain's colonies provided the raw materials that paid the cost. Aluminum from distant mines, rubber from plantations half a world away, oil from lands Britain barely held, all flowed through complex channels, arriving at American ports, transformed into goods that returned across the Atlantic. Survival required trade. Trade required leverage. Leverage required submission. Churchill, often portrayed as unflinching, understood the imbalance. In private correspondence, he described the measures as necessary but perilous. For the empire to continue, Britain could not afford to question its partner openly. The war demanded obedience. Yet each crate shipped across the ocean carried more than rifles and food. It carried influence, silently, invisibly, into American hands. The ledger replaced the battlefield as the arena of control. Victory would come, yes, but it would arrive at a cost that no medal or parade could measure. Scenes of ships leaving the Thames, bristling with crates and covered in tarps, could have passed for triumph. Dockworkers loaded iron, steel, and munitions, their faces streaked with soot and determination. And still, Britain needed more. Every convoy promised life, yet simultaneously nudged the empire toward a dangerous dependency. Financial records reveal the scale. Billions of dollars of goods transferred, gold reserves steadily depleted, colonies indirectly mortgaged to ensure the machinery of war kept turning. Survival was bought on terms designed by those who were not desperate, those who did not face the bomb streets or ration lines. In America, the narrative was different. Factories ran at full capacity, workers producing at record speeds, not for their own soldiers, but for a faraway ally. The halls of Washington whispered of strategy, of leverage, of the quiet advantages that would outlast the war. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's envoy to Britain, became the conduit of this new economic architecture. His meetings, ostensibly about aid, mapped the empire's dependencies with careful precision. The transfer of goods was humanitarian, the discussions of repayment or strategic concessions often secondary. Yet the outcome, inevitable and unseen, was the transformation of survival into obligation. Britain's social fabric frayed in subtle ways. Rationing extended beyond food, touching coal, clothing, even the most ordinary comforts of life. Citizens accepted hardship as temporary, heroic, necessary. But there was unease beneath the surface. Reliance on America was no longer a convenience. It was a structural necessity. Each telegram, each invoice, each convoy of steel bound the empire's fate more tightly to decisions made thousands of miles away, in rooms filled with charts and maps, not rubble and smoke. Dependency, like war, moves in silence before its consequences are felt. And yet, hope persisted. Britain's military still fought. Its people endured. Its colonies contributed. But every scene of perseverance bore a shadow. Every plane that took off from a British airfield, every ship that crossed the Atlantic, whispered a hidden truth. Aid had become extraction. Victory might arrive in London, in the form of guns, food, and munitions, but the ledger would carry the final tally. The empire's autonomy was measured in shipments and payments, in obligations that could outlast any battle. By late 1941, as convoys moved with increased urgency, the pattern became undeniable. Britain survived the Blitz. The Royal Navy protected its shipping lanes. Factories produced and repaired and produced. And yet, for all its victories, the empire was quietly hollowing. Each act of survival carried the weight of surrender. Dependency was invisible until it was unbreakable. And as the ships vanished over the horizon, carrying salvation to a grateful empire, the walls of autonomy began to crack, unseen but irrevocable. It is here, at this fragile point, that the story of Lend-Lease begins in earnest. Not merely a story of aid, but of leverage, subtle power, and economic conquest disguised as generosity. Britain would survive the immediate storm, but the foundation of its empire, the financial, colonial, and political sinews, were being quietly, systematically altered. Survival had a price, and that price, measured in resources, influence, and autonomy, would echo long after the last convoy returned to port. The machinery of Lend-Lease moved with the precision of a clockwork army. Across the Atlantic, American factories roared to life, producing tanks, planes, trucks, and rifles in numbers Britain could scarcely imagine. Assembly lines stretched endlessly, a symphony of steel and motion, each component a promise of survival. Yet survival was only the surface. Beneath it, the gears of influence, control, and extraction turned quietly, invisibly, with every shipment that crossed the ocean. Ships departed from New York, Boston, and Norfolk, hulls heavy with crates, steel-bound and labeled for Britain. Convoys sliced through Atlantic waters, escorted by destroyers, their decks bristling with guns against the lurking threat of U-boats. Each vessel carried more than munitions. They carried leverage. For every bomber that landed in a British airfield, for every truck that rumbled along muddy roads, Britain's financial and colonial foundations shifted incrementally toward American hands. Aid had become a tool, dependency a currency. Survival came at a price that few could calculate, and fewer yet dared to question. The system was meticulous. Contracts outlined obligations, repayment terms, and strategic concessions. In some cases, gold was transferred. In others, raw materials from colonies, aluminum, rubber, oil, flowed to American factories in exchange for finished goods. These transactions were invisible to most citizens, masked by the urgency of war, framed as necessity. Newspapers spoke of American generosity. London streets whispered of scarcity. And so the empire accepted, quietly, the invisible hand tightening around its economy, its autonomy, its future. At the heart of this system were the men who shaped policy. Harry Hopkins, a diplomat in the guise of a messenger, orchestrated shipments and agreements with the precision born of both vision and calculation. Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, reviewed contracts and shipping schedules, each decision threading Britain's dependence more tightly into American industrial might. They were not villains in the conventional sense. They were architects of influence. Aid was their instrument, trade their method, leverage their product. And the empire, desperate to survive, played the part of the willing student, unaware of how quickly the lesson would harden into obligation. The effects were immediate and undeniable. British industry, already strained by years of war, became reliant on foreign supply lines for raw materials. Aluminum for aircraft frames, rubber for tires, oil for engines. all flowed from distant lands, much of it extracted indirectly from colonies under British rule. Supplies that once moved through imperial channels now flowed through American contracts, with terms designed to favor the provider, not the recipient. Every shipment reinforced dependency. Every invoice reminded Britain that survival required obedience. And yet, on the surface, the war was being won, the skies defended, and hope maintained. Ships arriving in Liverpool, Glasgow, and London unloaded their cargo in a choreographed routine. Crates marked with the stars and stripes, planes taxiing across runways, trucks rolling into depots. For the British public, it appeared as salvation incarnate. Soldiers on the front lines received weapons, civilians received food and clothing, factories received machinery. Each success, each moment of relief, masked the subtle transfer of power that had been encoded into every shipment, every contract, every decision made thousands of miles away. The ledger, invisible to most, was as decisive as any battlefield. The economic architecture of Lend-Lease was deliberate. Payments in gold, arrangements to secure future resources, and the strategic positioning of American industry all converged to create a system where Britain's freedom to act independently was circumscribed by its need for continued supply. It was a quiet dominion. There were no flags flying, no armies occupying streets, no overt declarations of conquest. Instead, there was the constant rhythm of arrivals and departures, contracts signed and executed, invoices tallied and repaid. And in that rhythm, a silent lesson emerged. Empires can survive war, but they cannot survive dependency disguised as generosity. By 1943, the effects were clear. Britain had survived the Blitz, its factories hummed, and its people endured. But the economy, strained and indebted, showed signs of fatigue that military victories could not repair. Colonial resources had been siphoned to pay for survival, and financial obligations mounted. Every shipment of aid carried with it a hidden cost, each plane or truck a subtle reminder that autonomy was conditional. The empire's sovereignty, once absolute, had become negotiable, weighed against the urgency of continued support. And in Washington, the architects of Lend-Lease observed the results with measured satisfaction, their strategy unfolding as intended. This was not conquest by sword or bomb. It was conquest by calculation, measured, precise, and almost invisible. Britain fought on the front lines, but the battle for economic control had already been waged across desks, factories, and shipping lanes. Each act of survival carried the unspoken terms of leverage. Dependency had become a structure as solid as any wall, and just as difficult to dismantle. Citizens saw the planes in the skies, the supplies on the docks, the machines in factories. They did not see the balance sheets, the transfer of colonial resources, the slow erosion of fiscal autonomy. Even in victory, the empire's future was altered. Lend-Lease ensured that Britain could endure the immediate storm, yet it quietly reshaped the economic and political landscape. Decisions made in Washington, factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh, docks in New York and Norfolk, all combined to influence the fate of a nation thousands of miles away. The power of the United States, untested in combat yet formidable in production, had been deployed with precision. Britain survived, yes, but the independence that had once defined an empire had been compromised, threaded into contracts and shipments, woven invisibly into the fabric of wartime survival. By the end of 1944, the pattern was undeniable. Britain's victory over Germany, celebrated in newspapers and on city streets, had been facilitated not solely by bravery or strategy, but by the leverage inherent in every shipment, every invoice, every decision made by its supposed ally. The empire had traded autonomy for survival, and as convoys returned across the Atlantic, empty yet victorious, the truth settled quietly into ledgers, into shipping logs, into the hidden corridors of power. Aid had become extraction, dependency had become control, and the empire, though still standing, bore the invisible marks of its economic surrender. Survival, it became clear, was only the beginning. The machinery of Lend-Lease had ensured that Britain endured the war, but it had also rewritten the rules of engagement between empires. No cannon, no soldier, no fortification could protect a nation from the subtle, pervasive power of economic leverage. And as the docks emptied, the factories slowed, and the convoys paused, one question lingered in the quiet spaces between victory and aftermath. If survival requires dependence, what remains of freedom? The war ended, but Britain's battles had only shifted from the skies and seas to ledgers and balance sheets. London, battered but unbroken, welcomed victory with quiet relief. Streets filled with celebration, but ration lines remained, factories hummed slowly, and docks carried the steady rhythm of incoming and outgoing goods. The guns had fallen silent, yet the empire faced a quieter, more insidious test: the cost of survival. Victory had been purchased in shipments, invoices, and resources that Britain could no longer claim as entirely its own. Financial obligations lingered like shadows over the government. The billions of dollars spent under Lend-Lease had left Britain indebted, with gold reserves diminished and colonies stretched to provide repayment through raw materials and economic concessions. India's ports, African plantations, Southeast Asian oil fields, all had contributed indirectly to the machinery that had kept Britain alive. The empire had survived, yes, but not unscathed. Its autonomy, once a certainty, had been quietly compromised. Decisions that once belonged solely to London now carried the weight of prior dependency, the invisible strings of leverage stretching across the Atlantic. The colonies themselves sensed the shift. Imperial control had been weakened not by revolts or invasions, but by the empire's own reliance on foreign aid. Britain's financial exhaustion accelerated the momentum toward decolonization. India moved steadily toward independence. African nations began to demand self-rule, and the far reaches of the empire bristled with quiet unrest. The machinery of Lend-Lease had, in effect, reshaped the global balance of power. Britain remained on the map, its armies victorious, its flag still flying, but the empire that once commanded continents now depended on relationships it could not dictate. Survival had demanded concessions, autonomy had become negotiable. Economically, the story was stark. British industry had endured the war, but at the expense of its sovereignty. Raw materials exported to American factories financed the very tools that had kept Britain alive. Every plane, every truck, every tank arriving from the United States carried with it a hidden cost, a subtle transfer of power, a reminder that no empire survives purely on courage or valor. The ledger replaced the battlefield as the determinant of influence. And for Britain, the post-war years revealed the full scale of this quiet extraction. Cultural perception mattered as well. Citizens celebrated victory, waving flags and cheering returning soldiers, yet they understood only partially the depth of the empire's compromise. Newspapers highlighted triumphs and bravery, seldom the financial dependencies or strategic concessions that underpinned them. Public attention focused on the immediate relief, the end of air raids, the return of familiar routines. Behind this visible narrative, however, the structures of influence imposed by Lend-Lease had become embedded in the empire's economic and political foundations, shaping decisions for years to come. The United States, meanwhile, emerged stronger. Its factories had expanded, its industries refined, its global influence secured. Lend-Lease had strengthened not only its allies but itself, creating a web of economic leverage that would persist long after the last convoy had crossed the Atlantic. The war had been a crucible, testing not just armies but empires, and the machinery of supply had proven as decisive as any strategy on the battlefield. For Britain, the cost of survival became the blueprint of future dependence. For America, it was a model of power executed with subtle precision, invisible to those who celebrated victory at home. Britain's post-war austerity deepened the realization that survival had limits. The population endured shortages, the government struggled to rebuild, and the colonies began to assert themselves with increasing urgency. Decisions about trade, industry, and foreign policy now required consideration of the structures established by Lend-Lease. Autonomy, once taken for granted, was now measured against obligations set thousands of miles away, dictated not by soldiers or generals, but by contracts, shipments, and economic leverage. The empire remained, yet it was a shadow of the independence it had once claimed. Yet even amid the losses, Britain's endurance became a lesson in paradox. The empire had survived an existential threat, but the price was more than gold or raw materials. Its influence, once direct and unquestioned, had been supplanted by subtle control, invisible until it was undeniable. Lend-Lease had shown that dependency can be as binding as conquest, and that survival achieved through reliance can erode autonomy faster than any battlefield defeat. The empire stood victorious, yet hollowed. The machinery of aid had become the mechanism of influence, and the ledger, more than any army, had determined the future. This quiet extraction rippled through history. The colonies moved toward self-rule, independence movements gained momentum, and Britain's role in the world evolved. The empire's narrative of heroism and endurance coexisted with the underlying reality of economic subordination. Every treaty, every agreement, every reconstruction plan bore the fingerprints of a system designed to maintain leverage long after the war had ended. Survival had been secured, but at a cost invisible to the streets and squares filled with cheering crowds. And so, as Britain looked forward to reconstruction, it did so with a new understanding that empires are not only threatened by external enemies, but by the conditions under which they survive. Aid can be salvation, yes, but it can also be extraction. Survival can require dependence. Autonomy can become negotiable. The empire, triumphant in one sense, was constrained in another, bound by the invisible threads woven through convoys, factories, and ledgers. Every ship that crossed the Atlantic during the war had carried more than materials. It had carried the blueprint for a new global order. Victory and endurance coexisted with quiet compromise. Britain had resisted annihilation, its people had persevered, and its armies had fought with courage beyond measure. Yet the empire's independence had been subtly reshaped, its autonomy threaded into contracts and shipments it could not easily control. Lend-Lease had rewritten the rules of power, demonstrating that influence need not be exercised through occupation or conquest. Economic leverage, executed with precision, could achieve the same outcome, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. Every empire says it is different. Every empire believes it can survive solely on its courage, its strategy, its pride. Britain had endured, but its survival carried the hidden cost of dependency. Its autonomy had been compromised, its colonies nudged toward independence, its economic foundations subtly shifted. And in that quiet reality lies the lesson. Survival does not guarantee freedom. Aid can sustain life, but it can also shape the destiny of nations. The ledger, more than the battlefield, often determines which empires endure and which fade into history. If you want to understand how collapse begins, look at how comfort ends. The empire survived the war. It won. But the price of victory was written not in cannon fire, but in crates, invoices, and the silent, pervasive influence of a partner whose generosity masked a quiet, inevitable transfer of power. Survival had been secured, but autonomy had been quietly surrendered, leaving a legacy that would echo through the decades, a whisper of inevitability in the corridors of history.